This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is Alexander III of Macedon, otherwise known as Alexander the Great. I have three experts in his life, and the conversation will begin when we return. Alexander the Great is the topic, and I have three gentlemen here who will be talking about his life and the history and also the myths that they're promulgated down for almost 2.5 eons. On top is Christopher Blackwell. To the left is James Rahm. To the right is Tom Martin. And let me see if I can get rid of how this popped up. I've got little, okay, there we go. I had a little heart thing covering Tom's face for some reason, a little like thing. But anyway, before we get into talking about Alexander the Great, I'd like to just have each of the three men introduce themselves, tell a little bit about their interest in Alexander the Great and any works that they have done about them. Let me start on top. Christopher, if you could give a little précis about yourself.
Okay, yeah, very briefly. As an undergraduate, I was a classics major at Marlborough College, a small liberal arts college that effectively went out of business last year. That's merged with Emerson College in Boston. I went to graduate school at Duke University. My dissertation was on the political history of Athens during the career of Alexander the Great, sort of Athens and Macedonia. After getting my job, which I still have as a professor of classics, Herman University in South Carolina, I wandered away from Alexander, did a lot of computer stuff, Homeric manuscripts, but thanks to Tom Martin, got back into it. And he could tell you more about the book we wrote together.
Well, Tom,
in short, that's me.
Tom, I might as well pick up with you. Can you give a little background about yourself?
I'm Tom Martin. I'm a professor in the Department of Classics at the College of the Holy Cross, a liberal arts college in Worcester, Massachusetts. And I studied classics in college and in grad school. And when I was in grad school, through a long series of circumstances, my dissertation advisor turned out to be Ernst Badian, who was a very well-known scholar of Alexander the Great, with whom I did not work on Alexander the Great, but I did work on the meaning of Greek coinage, and that involved me with Alexander because I got to know his coins as sort of symbols and representations of his career, as well as many other things. And then subsequently, I've taught in departments of classics, so I teach Latin and Greek literature, language, Greek and Roman history, and that brought me back to Alexander. And with Chris Blackwell, we as a team wrote a book for a general audience trying to interpret Alexander, and it really helped me think about a lot of issues arising from Alexander. I get to teach about Alexander now, though my interests have focused on Alexander after Alexander, and the things that people in various places and in various times, many times and places that surprised me, what the people made of Alexander and what they made Alexander into. And so in that sense, his living on has fascinated me in many ways for a long time.
And James, if you could give a little background about yourself.
Yeah, so I came to Alexander from a very different direction. I was interested in the most distant parts of the earth. My dissertation was on the edges of the earth in ancient thought. And so I was interested in India. And of course, Alexander was the first Greek, well, not the very first, but first one who took a sizable contingent of Greeks into India and explored it. And so then I got into the exploration of India by Alexander, and I ended up editing the landmark Arian for the landmark series of ancient historians, which I was very pleased to be a part of. And since then, I've done a book called Ghost on the Throne, which is a narrative history of the period after Alexander's death, the struggle for his empire by his successors. That was in 2011.
Well, I should state up front, the reason that I was doing this show, I had just done a show last week about Sargon the Great, and I had done a trilogy of plays on Sargon, or actually I did on Cyrus the Great, on Sargon, Cyrus, and Alexander, who basically controlled the same territories, and each one getting successively larger in terms of their empires. And I found interesting parallels between them. Sargon was the first of them. He was the first of his dynasty. Cyrus was Cyrus II. He was the second, and Alexander was Alexander III of Macedon and the third. So it made just for a nice, it was a synchronous trilogy there. But I want to talk a bit about Alexander and why he's so well known. Because I think if you were to poll historians, if you were to poll people who know anything about history and the impact on modern society, I think Alexander, even though he's 2,300 years in the past, would probably be at least top 20, probably top 10 in terms of impact. So let's talk about Alexander's impact, both in the real terms and mythically. James, if you want to take that first.
Oh, wow. Well, yeah, as you say, it's huge. He really transformed the ancient world with his campaign of conquest, which was only 11-year period. But in that 11 years, he expanded the reach of Greek civilization all the way to the Indus River Valley and ended the Persian Empire, which had dominated Asia for the last 2 centuries before that, created a world of nation states or kingdoms rather than city states, fused the entire Greek world into one, more or less homogeneous whole, instituted a system of monarchy, hereditary monarchy that was virtually, divine right of kings. So the political world of the Mediterranean was totally transformed in the space of 1 generation. And that new configuration endured for the next several centuries.
Christopher, if you want to give your opinion about Alexander's input down to today.
Well, when I talked with my students about it, I say that without Alexander, there wouldn't be Christianity. And I really believe this, right? So it's a chain of causation, but Alexander, among other places, conquered Egypt and left a Macedonian bureaucracy in charge of Egypt. And as James was saying, he's written about this more than I've ever thought about it. But if you want to make something eternal, don't build a pyramid. Build a department of motor vehicles, right? Bureaucracies are the most durable things that human beings ever create. And so the Persians had this bureaucracy, and Alexander kind of took over it. And so when you went to pay your taxes, instead of speaking Persian, you just spoke Greek. But without Alexander, it would not have been the dynasty of the Ptolemies in Egypt. And they would not have undertaken to rule the world through knowledge by collecting all these books. They would not have paid for the translation of the Hebrew scriptures, this crazy little religious sect from the desert that nobody cared about these people. But they have a book. Let's translate it into Greek. We would not have had a world where a Syrian Jew who was also a Roman citizen naturally spoke and wrote Greek and could write in Greek to a Mediterranean audience who had access to Hebrew scriptures in Greek. Paul would not have had anything to say to the people of the Mediterranean if it weren't for Alexander and his conquests. So that's like my one sort of canned example of why Alexander was a big deal.
And Tom, how about you? What are your thoughts on Alexander's import?
Yeah, well, I want to second what both of my colleagues have said. I mean, James is absolutely right that this anomaly of Greek history, where you had city-states, as we call them, that were in some sense sovereign communities, politically and socially, without monarchs, almost all of them. This is very weird in human history. This starts to wane big time because of the effects of Alexander's career, as I think James was saying. I agree with Chris that Alexander's impact on religion to this day was huge. And I would say it's because of Alexander and followed by his would-be successor, Demetrius, the city besieger, that we have the concept of the God-man, which is absolutely fundamental, even if disputed, in the theology of Christianity. And so I'd add as a third point that seems to me why Alexander was so shocking in his own time and so charismatic. And I'm using that in a non-judgmental way. I'm not saying that's good or bad. That is to say, somebody who exudes an aura that attracts people's attention, whether positive or negative, is because Alexander made the impossibilities of mythology real, practical, and doable. In other words, Alexander did what no one had ever done, and nobody, maybe not even Alexander, thought was possible. I mean, can you imagine under the conditions of the time? Again, I want to emphasize, I'm not making at this point any evaluation of good, bad, or indifferent. But for crying out loud, if you can walk from Macedonia to northwest India and back, and have all the things happen to you that happened to Alexander, well, that really is mythological in its import, especially since mythological means what you learn from stories. It doesn't mean it's not true. And so he, showed people that, things that really you think aren't humanly possible just might be possible, for good or for bad, and that you really can, and this is something that maybe we want to debate and maybe other people don't agree, that you can, as famously said in 5th century BCE Greek literature, learn by experience, or if you prefer, learn through suffering. And I think that Alexander did learn. He may have had post-traumatic stress disorder as well, but I think that those two things then made Alexander, here's my last point, into a figure that people thereafter wanted to take over. You can call it cultural appropriation, you can call it emulation, but Alexander, as to take the title of Sufang Eng's recent book, Alexander from Britain to Southeast Asia, from antiquity to early modernity, was a figure of inspiration and one that, frankly, you wanted to be related to. For example, the potentates of early modern Malaysia, when they met the European imperialists who showed up on their ships and were acting haughty, the Malaysians said, well, who in the world do you think we are? We're descended from Alexander the Great. Have you got anything to match that?
So, Tom, let me ask you then if we could set the scene from where Alexander came from, both what Macedon was at the time he was born, as well as his father, King Philip. Because as a layman, I get the sense that Macedon was not necessarily considered the barbarians, but sort of a buffer zone between the barbarians. They weren't quite High Greek, they weren't quite barbarians, and that a lot of people have argued, and I've read that say that King Philip actually set in a lot of the, I guess, infrastructure of Macedonian society that helped Alexander. And a lot of people have said that Philip deserves the title of great too. What is your opinion, Tom, on both Macedonia at the time of Alexander's birth and his father?
It all depends whose opinion you're soliciting. what you just said is really what Greeks might have told you. The Macedonians would have said, I don't want to say anything vulgar, that you were full of it. The Macedonians would have said, I'm sorry, we are Greek by descent, from as far back as you, which means divine. We get to compete in the Olympic Games just like you. And in fact, we're braver than you. So what is your problem, you wimpy Southerners? Yes, we do live in an area that geographically is, kind of like an intersection, a four-way intersection with no stop signs, where everybody's driving tanks. Because we have peoples to the north of us and peoples to the west of us and maybe even to the east of us who might not be friendly. And so we have to deal with that. We're not really very afraid of you, Greeks to the south. But Macedonia was, and sort of to go back to an earlier point that James was alluding to, not politically organized in the same way. It was a kind of chiefdom monarchy, with sort of, to use another modern analogy, sort of barons controlling regions, but then picking somebody who would be their leader. I mean, it wasn't a democracy, and it didn't have city-states. And it was looked down upon by the Greeks. But Philip was a person of enormous, frankly, experience and learning. First of all, he'd been a political hostage, both among Greeks and among the northern enemies, the so-called barbarians. We should talk about what that means, as was later Alexander. He learned from those things. And yes, the reforms that he put in, especially in terms of military equipment and tactics, were very important. It was going to turn out. He was a person of great imagination. And if he hadn't been assassinated, then it's quite likely it would be Philip the Great. But as Alexander's career shows, and as Plutarch was one of the things that the later author wanted to assess, was Alexander successful because of his excellence or because of his luck? Well, Alexander had more good luck than his dad.
James, can you pick up your opinion on both Macedon and also King Philip?
Yeah, well, Tom raised a point that I've been writing about just recently, that Philip was a hostage, not in a bad way. He was a sort of a pledge for to assure compliance with the treaty, and lived at Thebes during its heyday in the 360s BC, when he was just a teenager. And Thebes at that time was the superpower of the Greek world, was being led by its own visionaries, Epaminondas and Pelopidas, and had fielded the best army, an army that had beaten the Spartans and was the primary infantry army in the Greek world. So Philip saw all that firsthand and took those lessons back with him to Macedon when he became king a few years later. And his reform of the army along the same lines as what Thebes had done was fundamental to the growth of the Macedonian Empire. Suddenly they had an army that was invincible, and it proved that 20 years later when it went up against the Greeks and the Thebans at the Battle of Chaeronea.
Christopher, if you could give your take on both Philip and Macedonia.
I mean, it's hard to add to what my colleagues have said. Just a couple of things, riffing off these themes. It's interesting, and Tom and I wrote about this in our book. Macedonia did have this kind of had this inferiority complex, because the rest of the Greeks considered them these like weird northern barbarians who just like drank all the time and didn't have a polis. One consequence of that is that the Macedonians had to try harder, right? So you get the Greek playwright Euripides gets offered this kind of cushy fellowship. He was like irritated that he wasn't winning competitions in Athens, so he was sponsored to spend the end of his life working in Macedonia. Obviously, Philip hired Aristotle to tutor his son, right? So these Macedonians it's kind of like, the court of the czars, where everybody spoke French and read Moliere and that stuff all the time, right? Just trying harder. The other thing, just especially for an American audience and people who 20th and 21st century, I think it's interesting that Philip, after taking all these lessons in like military prowess, got lucky in that the rest of the Greek world in the middle of the 4th century was involved in basically the ancient Greek equivalent of the Vietnam War, or the so-called Third Sacred War, which was protracted and incredibly ugly. And it was like guerrilla warfare. At one point, I wanted to write a book about this because I thought it was super interesting, but unfortunately, this guy, John Buckler, wrote a really good book about it, and literally that left nothing else to say. It's such an awesome book. So I was like, I can't possibly improve on this. But the Thebans and the Athenians and everybody were embroiled in this ugly, protracted, asymmetric warfare in the mountains of central Greece. And Philip, not to tell the whole story, you can read John Buckler's book, Philip kind of stepped in and sorted this out. And that was Macedonia's entry into an active role in Greek politics. And one thing led to another, and you end up with, as James said, the Battle of Chaeronea, and Philip, for the first time ever, or maybe since Agamemnon, having one Greek person able to call the shots for the Greek political world generally.
So let's talk a little bit about sort of the soap opera melodrama that was the court of Macedon here, because Philip is assassinated. He had married a younger woman. Alexander's mother was not a full Macedonian, or she was from a different tribe. And so Alexander worried, I guess, and some of his supporters worried that he would be cut out if the father reproduced with the new wife. So let me start with you, Christopher. This is very soap operatic. It's very Greek. I mean, the Greeks literally invented melodrama. Do you think that there's any proof that Alexander might have been behind it, or was he part of a conspiracy or not to kill his father?
So did Alexander and Alexander's mom have Philip whacked? Because this is the question, right? This is the question that every modern person asks, and they really, somebody ought to make a movie about this, right? It's like a Philip assassination truther movement or something, right? To find out what's going on. It doesn't look good, right? So Philip, as you said, Dan, getting married to a new, younger Macedonian woman at the celebration of this event, he gets assassinated, and the assassin is conveniently immediately killed by, we're told, that I speak under correction, James, you're the editor of Arian, by Alexander's cohort of buddies, right? So they immediately kill the guy. So it doesn't look good. When Tom and I were writing our book, which was one of the most satisfying professional experiences of my entire life, and it's entirely due to Professor Martin's getting to sit at his feet, we were trying to put ourselves in an ancient frame of mind to think about this from an ancient point of view. And one thing that we thought about was the fact that generally ancient writers don't accuse Alexander of parricide. This doesn't come up. Every modern reader of the story immediately jumps to that conclusion, and it's not as widespread in antiquity. And it's from reading Sophocles with my students that I had the idea, we had the idea, and we talked about it. From an ancient point of view, Alexander has pretty good evidence that he didn't conspire to kill his father, because he went on to be great and successful. And I think in the ancient Greek mind, if you killed your father, you inevitably inherited this pollution. And his subsequent success alone would prove that maybe he didn't. So, I don't know. We can be cynical and skeptical of that, but that was something I remember having a lot of satisfaction thinking about when we were working on the book. But both Tom and James can correct me and fill this out
Well, Tom,
if I've gone off on a wild tangent.
Tom, if you want to take that up.
I would say that for me, I mean, the case obviously can't be proved one way or the other. But I agree with, the conclusion we reached at Chris that, if you force me to make a decision, then I would say, no, he didn't. Why? I would add, because I think it's important to understand the incredible motivating power of what I'm going to call insult in the culture of that time and place. And frankly, of any time and place, as far as I can tell. I mean, if you, for example, as I've been doing, as a sort of, escape from the pandemic, reading Thucydides for the umpteenth time, and, thinking, I wonder if I could argue that the Peloponnesian War actually broke out as a result of insults. Yeah, I know there were lots of actual, practical, horrible things going on, but the power of insult cannot be, frankly, overestimated. And it's possible to explain Philip getting killed by people feeling insulted, specific person being insulted, and deciding to do what, people of Greek culture thought was absolutely required, which is to take revenge. And the word usually used for revenge is a word that has to do, at least semantically, with the notion of honor, your respect for yourself. And that's, frankly, more than an adequate motivation for killing somebody, especially in the context of monarchy. I mean, if you look at the history of monarchy in China, to say nothing of the United Kingdom, or Europe, you can see, and James made an excellent reference to the Kingdom of Persia. I mean, for crying out loud, the sort of, standard response, lowest common denominator for the problem of succession in royalty is assassination. So, yeah, you could do that, but I would put in the other side of the balance, remembering how important insult is. And to this very day, of course, that's still true among human beings everywhere.
James, where do you come down on the Philip assassination?
I agree that it's unlikely, that there's no good reason to see Alexander behind it or his mother. Really, I think he had much more to lose than gain from Philip's death. And I'm indebted to an article by Elizabeth Carney that made this argument that he was about to go on the campaign into Asia with his father. He had, a chance to win huge amount of glory and plunder and, secure his place in the line of succession. It's hard to think he was threatened by an infant who would not come of age to rule for another 15 or 16 years. And in that time, he had every hope of, prospering and advancing as his father's chosen favorite. So in terms of motive, I really don't see that he had a motive. And so that leads me to think he wasn't involved.
Well, let me, the next question for you, James, to start off. Let's talk, before we get into a litany of his accomplishments and his battles and his successes, innovations, etc. Let's talk about who Alexander seems to have been from the best historical evidence. Because on the one hand, he is often considered, if not the greatest military mind of all time, certainly in the top 3 or 4. He also, though, seems to have been very much a narcissist. He seems to have been, or what we would modernly call a narcissist. He seems to have sometimes, he later claimed that he was actually the son of Zeus, whether this was just simply his brooding it or he actually bought into his own mythos at some point. If so, he might not have, I don't know, was he maybe a little bipolar? He had there was also the famed incident about his father buying Bucephalus, the horse that he loved until his death, I believe, or close to it. And then, of course, there's the question of whether or not he was bisexual or homosexual. So let me just ask you about the state of mind of Alexander in all of these areas before we get on to his accomplishments. So, James.
Well, of course, that's one of the most complex questions that we could possibly ask.
Which is why I'm asking you.
Well, let me start with your use of the term narcissist. So I don't think that's an appropriate term in the context of an ancient monarchical culture where, prowess in war and politics was the primary way of achieving glory. This was a culture that revered Achilles as the greatest of mythic warriors. Achilles, if you remember from the Iliad, is someone who, because he was deprived of a single concubine as one of his prizes of battle, refused to fight and was willing to let his whole army perish to preserve his own honor and dignity. So, that's the kind of person today we would think of as deeply disturbed. But in the context of, ancient military monarchy, he was a great warrior, a great hero. And Alexander admired Achilles, wanted to be like Achilles, wanted to be the best in all things, thought of himself as descended from Achilles because his mother his mother's royal line came from Achilles' son, Neoptolemus. So he was a man of incredible ability who inherited an army that was second to none, and he decided to use it to its full extent and to use his own abilities to their full extent. So I don't think we can pathologize that. I think, he was just an extraordinary individual who happened to inherit the equivalent of the atom bomb, a weapon that had no match.
Tom, let me go to you about the state of mind of Alexander, because I think you were the one who brought up, I think it was you or either Christopher maybe who brought up about he was one of in this lineage of God men. To me, that would, to the modern eye, to claim that you are the son of God or you are divine yourself seems a little bit on the haughty side. What is your take on Alexander's mindset, Tom?
Well, I have to say that I agree with James fully. I mean, narcissism is a clinical, psychological, psychopathological diagnosis in which the person, in some ways like a sociopath, doesn't understand, it seems, that other people have feelings or are affected by what other people say or do. And I think that's not true at all of Alexander. James is absolutely right that the cultural parameters were very different, or at least we can compliment ourselves and say that they were. I'm not sure that I actually think that they are. But let me turn to that second point, in which I have to say, Dan, I really think, if I understand you, I disagree. I don't think that it's a matter of self-delusion or some sort of lack of understanding to think of yourself as descended from the divine or actually to be divine. I imagine, all Christians would disagree with you. And I'm not speaking from a Christian perspective. But it's completely reasonable if you look both at Greek culture and Greek early philosophy and indeed at other non-Greek systems to think that human beings can have the divine in them or actually be divine. And so that's not at all a strange or unlikely notion. It was commonly held to be possible. It came into full, I think, flower in one sense, not in the way that it's going to develop over the following centuries, but at that point it was, the Greeks would say, the kind of kairos, the very moment of opportunity when the possibility of imagining, a human being who is divine became, in some sense, conceptualized as a reality. Alexander died too soon to find out what it would be like to have a God-man among us. That's what Demetrius' career was about. It didn't work out very well. And in some ways, I think that had an effect on what, later God-men did and didn't do. But I think it's a perfectly understandable and not at all psychopathological phenomenon for that time and place. Indeed, frankly, for any time and place.
And Christopher, are you still there? Because he froze up. I know it looks like he was walking in. Well, let me just ask you then, Tom, since there he is. Okay. Before I get to you, Christopher, I just wanted to ask, in the modern sense, a term like homosexuality wasn't even known then. What do we know if Alexander, for example, his friend, some people say love of Hephaestion, years later died under tragic circumstances, and was the Macedonian army, were they inclined to what we would now in the modern sense call homosexuality, or was that an accepted part of their culture, Tom?
Well, first of all, I mean, as far as I know, sort of human sexual proclivities have been within, certain parameters forever, though I realize that's controversial. But certainly the cultural parameters and understanding of categorization have differed. And I don't think it's very helpful to think of males in that time period as heterosexual or homosexual, although undoubtedly were people who did fall into categories that would, align with modern conceptions. But I'll just say in short that the concept of whether there could be erotic relations among males was controversial. And even in the places where it was admitted or legal, it was usually not meant to be between males of the same age. And it was a sort of special relationship between an older man and a younger man that might or might not involve various forms of physical sex. And that when people were criticized and jokes were made, about their sexuality, it usually was with how you behaved as whatever it is you actually were doing in that context. And so I think that it's a more complicated situation than our modern categorizations allow for. And it's not the Macedonian army that is said to have had a special, brigade of men who were erotically connected in pairs. That's Thebes. James, I'm sure, could speak more to that. But all I will say is that it was A, controversial, and B, not conceptualized in the way that at least modern adjectives tend to imply.
Christopher, picking up on that, what is your thoughts on who Alexander was as he ascended to the throne and was about to conquer the known world?
Yeah, well, I'm from South Carolina, right? So we say, like, it ain't bragging if you can do it. And I would maybe extend that in a pervasive meritocracy. It's not narcissism if you actually are the best, right? Somebody's got to be at the top. And if you have a meritocratic society, you have to assume that there is an apex to the pyramid. Alexander was there and acted like it, right? As was only appropriate. And, when I teach this stuff with my students and try to make things relevant, I think there are plenty of modern examples of, leaders who, by some standards are like jerks or narcissistic or whatever, but by others, get the job done. So famously Steve Jobs, right? Like parked in the handicap spot with his like Mercedes or whatever. But there is no possible way that he could have brought Apple from 2 weeks from bankruptcy to a trajectory to be a $2 trillion company if he didn't inspire the people who work for him. And I think Elon Musk is another figure like that. Like the guy, maybe he's crazy, but the damn rockets land themselves, right? Like you can't escape that. I think Tom alluded to the mere fact of getting a bunch of strong guys to walk to India and back. Like you're not accomplishing that if you are a clinical narcissist, right? Like you have to have a sensitivity to your soldiers, an understanding of what they're feeling, and an ability to lead them through empathy by example in order to accomplish that. And so whatever, Alexander might not have been the person you want to babysit your kids, but I don't think there's any way to see him as less than a very successful member of his community, quite frankly. So as for the sexuality, yeah, Tom said it all. I think it's probably important to mention that the ancient Greeks weren't woke, right? Like they made fun of each other and insulted each other all the time. They just did it under different categories from modern people. Your sexual activities and proclivities would absolutely be the subject of mockery in an ancient Greek community, just under different categories. I think it's interesting. James brought up the Iliad. I think one thing that's interesting when you read Homer is to observe how that poem works to be universal. And I think one of the things we see is that the Iliad is famously coy on the precise nature of the relationship between Achilles and his friend Patroclus. It's easy to assume they were lovers. It would be easy to assume they weren't because nothing in the poem says anything about that. But I think different communities in the Greek world had different standards. And when you look at the Iliad, you get the kind of acceptable to every community standard relationship between Achilles and Patroclus. Like they loved each other, they were dear friends, and that's where the poem stops.
So we left off speaking about Alexander. He has now ascended the throne. He has no real rivals within Macedonia. I guess he killed off any few people who might have challenged him. So now he has to sort of pacify the Balkans, Greece itself, and then move on to Asia Minor. Persia is, of course, the big player. The Greeks, in some sense, have been harangued by Persia for a couple of centuries. So let me start with you, Tom. Let's talk about what Alexander had to do to first get Greece under his thumb and then his planning outward into Asia. So if you could pick up the story there, Tom.
Well, to follow on a point that Dan and others made early on, what Alexander basically did was, so to speak, pick up the flag that his father had been carrying and got himself appointed after a show of force as the leader, the hegemon of the Greeks in an alliance, which meant that he was going to control their foreign policy in the sense of, you have to send soldiers with me. But then the mission was framed in terms of, to go back to a theme that I mentioned earlier, revenge. That is to say, getting justice to restore our honor from the Persians who, attacked us. This was the Greek point of view. It wasn't actually like that, at least in its complex origins. So we are going to go and exact revenge with the help of the gods who are on our side. And so Alexander's constantly sacrificing, I think in total good faith, to the gods for this. And so the Greeks are both obligated because they had sworn oaths, and swearing an oath meant that you gave your word before the gods, and if you broke it, then you'd be guilty of impiety, which you could expect the gods to punish sooner or later. So in that sense, the Greeks were both, as a matter of practicality, they feared being attacked by Alexander, at least if they were big enough to count. The Spartans didn't count, so he ignored them. They're an example of how demography is destiny. They basically, unreproduced themselves out of history in about a century. They went from number 1 to 0. It's really a very interesting point that pertains, if the Spartans had known about Roman immigration, they might not have been so xenophobic. But that's a topic for another day. So Alexander, both because of threats of force if necessary, and also because of the sworn allegiance of the Greeks, was able to lead this force against Persia for, he said, and he kept saying this, by the way, all the way to the end, to take revenge for Greece and to defend Greece's freedom, which I don't think he was being hypocritical about that. It just goes to show how flexible, so to speak, the semantic field of freedom might be. And so I don't know if that addresses all the issues you wanted to talk about, Dan, but that's what I would say for now.
Well, James, let me ask you to pick up the next sort of chapter. I believe it's before he actually crosses the Bosporus, or whether the Bosporus or the Dardanelles. I think he pays a visit to the Temple of Apollo and the Delphic Oracle. And is that when he, I think, cuts the Gordian knot, mythically speaking, James?
No, the Gordian knot was in Asia, in his first year in Asia. But we haven't mentioned what for the Greeks was really the sort of standout event of Alexander's consolidation of his rule over Greece, the destruction of Thebes. And earlier I compared the Macedonian army to the atom bomb. So this was like the Hiroshima of the Greek world. It was a demonstration of massive, ruthless force by Alexander to show the Greeks that things weren't ever going to go back to the way they were. The Macedonians had total control over the Central Greek and even the Southern Greek world, except for Sparta, which, as Tom was saying, didn't count anymore, so it didn't matter. Arrian, writing some centuries later, said that this was the worst disaster the Greeks had ever suffered in their entire history. An entire city, a major Greek city, just wiped off the map in a space of a week or so. Its entire population either put to the sword or sold into slavery, and its buildings pulled down so that it could not be inhabited again. It was actually rebuilt some decades later, but at the time it seemed like it was gone forever. So that pretty much terrorized Greeks into compliance. And although they did try to mount rebellions later on, it proved to be too late. So Alexander established a total control over the European theater, and that enabled him to go into Asia with, relatively free and clear.
Well, let me just then pick up, because two of the more interesting battles, you mentioned Thebes being this disaster in the Greek world. He goes into Asia Minor, and he has the battle, I believe it's pronounced Issus, and Darius III becomes sort of, in history, this sort of cowardly figure who's constantly running from Alexander. He encounters him and he's retreating. He encounters him. It's almost like that old TV show F Troop, where he reverses the flags and runs. And then also
This is about ancient history, isn't it?
Yeah, and then I also want to speak about the Battle of Tyre, because to me this seems like an incredible thing straight out of mythos, that he builds this isthmus out to an island after 6, 8, 9 months, whatever it was, and then destroys the whole city. So, James, if you could just pick up on that, both Darius as his sort of, I guess you would call it maybe the Wile E. Coyote to Alexander's Roadrunner, and also Tyre.
Well, those are two very different things. I guess I'll address the entire thing, and I'll leave my colleagues maybe to pick up the other.
Okay.
You know, the technological advances in warfare in the Age of Alexander were just staggering. You know, artillery weapons had only come on the scene maybe 50 years earlier, and already by Alexander's time, they've grown sophisticated enough so that city walls are almost useless. You know, the primary defensive mechanism of the last several centuries was suddenly not valid anymore. So warfare was changing at lightning speed. And the siege of Tyre was a demonstration of that a city that was really thought to be impregnable because of its offshore location, the strength of its walls, and the fact that it had a superior navy to defend it. All of that seemed impossible to overcome. And Alexander put in 7 months. It was a massive operation. It was stymied a couple of times, but then went forward again. And Alexander demonstrated to the entire world that his mastery of technology, of the new science of war, was such that no city could withstand it.
Yeah, it's interesting, James, because if you look on Google Maps or on Google Satellite, you can see Tyre from space now. You can still see the isthmus, and he literally changed the weather and the ocean or the sea patterns around there.
Yes, right. It's visible from space.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's a fascinating operation. You can read it in great detail in Arrian's account, and it's really an impressive thing. Of course, he might not have succeeded even then if not for the defection of a sizable portion of the Phoenician navy, and that's explicable simply by the fact that he suddenly looked like the winner. As soon as the balance had tilted in his favor, other people started to come over to his side, and he gained a navy which he might not otherwise have had.
Well, Christopher, let me have you talk about Darius III. Now, in my previous show about Cyrus the Great, we didn't get into Darius the Great, who was the great Persian. I think he was Darius the First. This is, I guess, his grandson or great grandson, and is the reputation that Darius III has this sort of like Chicken Little, that is that well earned? Oh, Christopher, you're not. We can't hear you. Is your
okay.
There
Sorry.
You go. There you go.
I think I need to defer to Tom on this. If I were to speak about Darius III, I would be making stuff up.
Okay.
I will. I would like to add a little bit to what James said about the siege of Tyre.
Yeah, go ahead.
And with Alexander, we really have the first time in ancient European history that the city walls didn't work. I think it's really important to emphasize that. Like, I can't think of a single example of a city being taken from without somebody opening the door. And this goes back to Troy, right? Like, the only way the Greeks got Troy was by getting people inside to open the door. And so this was a real game changer, as James says. And the other thing, because I'm always trying to make things modern and relevant. If you watch Penn and Teller, the magicians, they'll tell you that one of the keys to professional magic is that the audience can never believe how much work a magician will do to make the trick happen. And this is, I think, as James was saying, this is what Alexander, nobody could believe that anyone would put in this much work to take a city. And he was the one who was willing to do the work. And so, but for Darius, I've got to defer to my colleagues because
Tom,
you don't need me to talk about it.
Tom, if you want to pick up.
I don't know. I would say that in Darius III, Alexander was extremely lucky in his opponent. That often in monarchies, because of the kind of struggles and internecine murders that we were talking about, the cream doesn't always rise to the top because sometimes the cream gets thrown out. In any case, I don't know, Darius III didn't have too much experience, and he clearly wasn't, at least to judge from Arrian, and James will know better than I, but in my interpretation of Arrian's description of Darius III, for example, in the first battle in which the kings actually faced each other at Issus, there on the eastern Mediterranean coast, that Darius was too prone to listen to his sycophantic advisors who would praise his decisions about where the army should take up its position. And of course, in this kind of mixed arms warfare, having the right ground, so to speak, for your army was crucially important. And Alexander basically outsmarted him, because Alexander, even though, of course, he didn't like being criticized, and as Christopher was saying, when you're number one and you know it, you want to be respected as number one. But Alexander, when at least he had time to think about it, he realized he should listen to what his advisors had to say. He could disagree and make the decision, but then sometimes they were right. I mean, take his close advisor Parmenion. Sometimes he rejects his advice, and sometimes he takes it. Alexander, in other words, and Arrian seems to me does a really good job of showing how Alexander, throughout the work, he says Alexander thought about it, and he had this supposition, is one of the words that Martin Hammond uses. This is what Alexander predicted, and it turns out to be true. Well, Alexander was good at that, and Darius wasn't, probably because of failures of strategy and leadership. How is it that an unquestioned leader, I mean, they're kings, right? So it's not a matter of equality. How does a king stay number one, but at the same time get really hard-nosed advice from smart advisors who disagree with him or her, if you're speaking of a queen? And Alexander was able to pull that off, and Darius wasn't.
James, so after Tyre and after Issus, does Alexander go down into Egypt and become the pharaoh there? And does he leave Persia for his generals, or what's the sequence of events or is he battling on two fronts in Persia and Egypt?
Yes, there's a sort of an interlude after Issus where the two sides disengage briefly. Darius goes back to his base to basically recruit another army, a bigger army. And Alexander goes to Egypt. Egypt was the wealthiest province of the Persian Empire, and it was also the most disaffected. So Alexander could count on a warm welcome there, which he got, and also a huge source of revenue. And then he also makes this very strange detour to the Oracle of Ammon in the desert, and things transpired there that we don't really understand, and there are several different accounts that don't agree. But it's basically a year of disengagement between the two sides before the big battle, the climactic battle at Gaugamela.
Well, was the oracle that you just spoke of, was that the one that predicted him as basically the, invincible, that he was destined for this?
That's one of the several accounts that we have. We have numerous different versions of what transpired there, and probably none of them are trustworthy because it was only a small contingent of people that were there, and all of them have their own agendas for reporting on what happened and spinning it in their own way, especially Alexander. So I don't want to comment. I don't want to come to any conclusions about what happened there.
Well, Tom, after he sort of, I guess we call it nowadays, liberates Egypt from the Persians, does he then, after that year, a break that James just mentioned, does then he go full on to just basically it's all-out war against Persia?
Yeah, but geographically, he's marching through the Persian Empire from the time he gets across the Hellespont into what is today modern Western Turkey. So he marches east through Turkey, then south through Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Gaza, the West Bank, until he gets to Sinai, Egypt, where, as James well said, he doesn't face any opposition. They're glad to see him. And so it's a kind of restorative break in all kinds of ways. And then he turns around and goes back. And so he goes back up north, through, I hope this is a neutral term, the Levant. And then at that point, he's getting closer to, what would have been, this is totally imprecise, the sort of heartland of the Persian Empire. He's not in the original Persian territory yet, but it's fully within, the empire's sphere of total control. And so he's back up in sort of northwest Mesopotamia. And that's where then, poor Darius III eventually is going to have another full-fledged battle at the Gaugamela, if that's the right geographical name, where again, it's a tough battle. I mean, the Persians have got lots of troops. Obviously they have this incredibly, mixed ethnic army. I mean, the command structure of the Persian army has always just amazed me. How in the world could you have this humongous army in which you have people speaking scores of different languages? They're all dressed differently. They got different weapons. They have different tactical training. They eat different things. They worship different deities. How that you can get them into the field at all seems to me a miracle. And I think that they were very successful because people would just say, holy moly, we give up. We just can't face an army that big. But of course, Alexander, as my colleagues have said, that didn't faze him. And so once again, it was, I think that Alexander's tactics were extremely successful, though it was a very tough battle because the Persians were no slouches, which I repeat is a kind of military miracle to me. And in both cases, since Darius wasn't taking an active military role, and like Alexander, another thing that Arrian emphasizes is how often, from the beginning to the end, Alexander actually leads the charge that gets the battle going.
Yeah.
Whereas Darius, and he takes up either the right or the left wing, depending on where the greatest danger to the forces are. Darius always stays in the middle. Why? Because Persian kings are at the middle of everything, and they have to be in the middle. And so basically, Darius is just there watching. And when things aren't going well, Darius says, excuse me, I have a previous engagement.
Yeah.
And he turns around and runs away, which is what he does. I mean, hey, would I have done that? I would have left before Darius. I'm not saying that I blame him. But that's in a sort of semi-facetious way what happens.
So let me just ask you, Tom, and then Christopher, you can maybe pick it up. Is Gaugamela then basically the battle after which there's no coming back? Persia, it's just a matter of conquering the outer reaches of the Persian Empire, and is that the point where some of Alexander's men are getting fed up with his Persianization, his or Persiophilia?
No, that's going to come significantly later.
No.
Yes, the Persian royal army as a monolith is defeated and isn't going to face him again. But remember, the Persian Empire extends all the way to India, for crying out loud. And so there is resistance that will continue. And Alexander has to go south down Mesopotamia, then back up through Iran, and then northeast. And there is resistance all the way. And of course, there are pretenders, so to speak, who are trying to take over the Persian throne. But yes, you're right, Dan. Gaugamela is the final decisive military victory, but it's not at all clear, I think, on the day after Gaugamela, there's just going to be a walk in the park from there on, quite the contrary.
Christopher, then let me ask you then. I mentioned this sort of Persiophilia that he had. That's just my modern term for it. Tom said it comes to a head a little bit later on. But also, he seemed to have also been a student of history, and he seemed to have had a great respect for Cyrus the Great 200 years earlier. There's the famous incident that I think after he comes back from India, he found out that his men that he put in charge of Cyrus's tomb had raided it, and he tracked them down, killed them as a show of respect for Cyrus. What was What do you think that that was all about? Because it seemed to have been something that caused friction with his men. Was he just really a student of history?
Well, I mean, I think he was a thoughtful leader, right? And as I mean, Tom already mentioned the ongoing miracle that was the Persian army, right? Like making that work. It's probably worth mentioning that there were always like a huge number of Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia, like this whole time. And I don't know the numbers, but I've heard it. You know, we read that at any given moment there are more Greeks fighting against Alexander than with him. That maybe is something people make up. I don't know what the basis of numbers are. But especially having gone as we've talked about down to Egypt and everything, I think Alexander clearly understood that if you're going to presume to take over this great empire, it's a multicultural empire, and you have to be a multicultural leader. And I think from all the sources, there was considerable friction among the Macedonians on this point. Like they're like, we're your buddies, we're this Macedonian meritocracy, right? Like where, to the extent that Tom and I wrote about this in the book, the Macedonians had rules for like how you fit in, and they were super strict. So one of the rules among Macedonians is that you couldn't recline at dinner like a grown up until you had killed a boar with just a spear. And it was Tom, who was it? It was Antipater's son, right? I'm sorry, I'm spacing on his name.
Cassander.
Yeah, Cassander. Like
Cassander,
he wasn't
allowed to be a big boy,
Yeah, like he had to eat at the kiddie table. I mean, this is after he'd been a general and like led troops in battle and like won all these victories, and still had to eat at a little kid's table because he just hadn't happened to have a boar run onto his spear at any point. So this is how the Macedonians were used to thinking. And then clearly Alexander is trying to be king of the empire he's taken over. And you can't be king of the Persian Empire if you're like insist on Macedonian ways. I don't know any other way to say it. Then there is some, I think, erratic behavior by any standard, like as they go farther toward India. We see this in Plutarch. As he starts to cross over into India, his treatment of his inner circle, I think, is not all that could be desired. I don't know, it causes problems.
So James, how far into India did Alexander get? His men basically force him to head back, to pull back to Persia, and then eventually, hopefully, I guess, to Macedonia. What happened there?
Well, he didn't actually get to the modern borders of India, or maybe just a tiny step in. Where he was what is now Pakistan.
Yeah.
Greeks called it India because it was the valley of the Indus River.
Yeah.
He was in the Punjab, the Indus River tributary system for much of 327 BC, 327 and following. And he got as far east as easternmost branch of that system, what the Greeks call the Hyphasis River. And he was intending to cross that river and proceed eastward because he'd heard of yet another kingdom further east with even more wealth and power than the one he just conquered. And his troops refused to go. They didn't see any point in going further, and they had heard that this kingdom to the east had a lot of war elephants. They'd had a lot of trouble dealing with the war elephants that they'd already encountered. So they refused to go. Alexander had a terrible public relations problem. He had to find a way to back down without losing face. he retreated to his tent for 3 days and emerged with the announcement that the auspices were no longer good for a crossing, and that the army would proceed south and west rather than east from that point.
Now, he had left in Persia some of his underlings as the satraps that took over the various provinces of the Persian Empire. As he's coming back, he's probably, I guess, midway to, almost halfway back to Greece, I guess. Is that when he dies? And do we know exactly how he dies?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Yes, he dies in Babylon, which he had intended to be the center of his empire, the capital. I'd be interested to hear what my colleagues think about his death. It's a huge question, which has been argued all different ways. And even in antiquity, it was being argued because some of the writers on Alexander claimed that he was poisoned and that his symptomatology was that of a poisoning. And others report something more like a terminal illness, infectious disease, and deny that he was poisoned. So you can argue either case. I tend to think it was a natural death, not an assassination. But I don't claim to be convinced one way or the other.
Tom, do you think he was poisoned? Or?
I agree with James. I think that he got an infection, like one that's cursing the world today. Then I think he probably experienced severe dehydration because of alcohol consumption, which was thought to be therapeutic in some cases. And alcohol does kill some bacteria, and there may well have been underlying conditions. And I think it would have been difficult to poison him, frankly, from a practical point of view. But again, it's like the assassination of his father. There can't be any decisiveness. But I'm not sure what good it would have done his supposed, rivals in Macedonia to kill him, even though, of course, they were afraid that they might be replaced by him. But I don't know. Alexander had a lot of plans for the future, and I think it would have been places for lots of people. So in any case, I think I agree with James.
And how about you, Christopher? Are you in that camp?
Yeah, I've never seriously thought of Alexander's death as an assassination. I think Occam's razor. People get sick and die, and as Tom said, like it's hard to identify anybody. I mean, these are serious people, right? Like the serious professional and ambitious soldiers. It's very difficult to see anybody making the calculation that like my life will definitely be better if I kill this guy. I just don't. I don't see it.
So when Alexander dies, he has at the time probably, I guess, the largest land empire up to that point in human history. And then we get what's called the Wars of the Diadochi, which are his generals and I guess some of his satraps that he appointed, basically carving up the spoils of war and battling each other. Tom, maybe if you want to take on, what does that do, and does that hasten the demise of Macedonia as a power, or how long do they hang on?
I mean, I think what happens is what happens in monarchies when you don't have an adult successor who's proven his or her capability. And Alexander didn't expect to die at that age. He didn't have any, children beyond the baby stage, if any, and that just wasn't any succession, and so that's what happens. The effects were, given that we talk about Alexander's empire, but I think we have to recognize this was not a strictly administered, very super organized, giant nation. I mean, Alexander, once he got to the heart of Persia, he left the Persian governors or administrators in place. I mean, he had to use the local infrastructure politically and socially. And so like the Roman Empire, in my opinion, it's very loosely governed. Is it top down? Yeah. But, in most of your, as an ordinary person's daily activities, you might not even have any idea who's in charge. right? It doesn't really make any difference. And so the fact that it would fracture, quote unquote, well, it's already fractured. If you want to use that metaphor, I think it's the wrong metaphor. It's a multi-divisional society. And so, and given the difficulties of communication and, as Chris well said, leadership, I think what happened was, in a certain sense, inevitable. And it did have, as James said at the very beginning of our discussion, really long range and significant consequences for Europe, Southwest Asia, and indeed even Central Asia.
Christopher, let me just turn to you then. Alexander has died. The empire is being warred over. What impact does he have in the immediate future, the next few decades after his death, and then going outward? I mean, there's the myth, as we said, of the Gordian knot. There's the famous anecdote about Diogenes, get out of my light, and also the biggest one being that he is unbeaten in battle and considered, peerless on the field. So what does the ancient world think of Alexander, within the first few decades of his death?
I think James has literally written the book on this.
Okay.
He might be better to answer this question, especially in the immediate aftermath. I'm not sure I know.
Okay.
I'm not sure I have anything to say on that. So
James?
I will defer to James.
Yes, well, Christopher, you're tipping your hat to Ghost on the Throne, which is a study of the 7 years after the death of Alexander that tries to follow, because it's an incredibly complicated time, the different cross currents and rivalries and the confusion over just what was going to happen. There was a simultaneous leadership vacuum at the political level and at the military and the political level, because Alexander was a king and a general at the same time, and there was no one who could fill either role, never mind both, successfully. So it was pretty much inevitable that things would fall apart. But the way in which they fell apart is a fascinating story.
Do you think, James, that with Persia having been conquered and then these wars of the Diadochi, that's destabilized the political situation there? Because just having read some things and also seen some YouTube videos about Alexander, some people wonder why he didn't move eastward. Why wasn't he interested in North Africa or in Rome? But it seems to me they were backwaters at the time. Persia was the big prize, and once that's shattered, what was the ancient world in chaos, basically?
Well, certainly the eastern half of it was, yeah. But to address your point, why not move west? He was apparently planning to do just that.
Oh, yeah.
There's a document that is reproduced in one of the ancient historians, and seems to be authentic, in which he laid out his plans for the future, and they included a campaign across North Africa to the Straits of Gibraltar and back again through southern Europe. So he wanted to do a full sweep of the Mediterranean, and that would have included Rome, which at that time was not in a position to resist him.
Well, let me just end with giving each of you some final say, but I want to just ask a final question, and then you can wrap up your opinions. I'll start with you, Christopher. Is there any, when I was doing the Cyrus the Great show a week or so ago, the fellow I was interviewing thought that probably the best parallel to Cyrus was the much later Temujin, Genghis Khan of the Mongol Empire, that they had the most similar, if you were to pick, the sort of long-lost twin, historically speaking. Who would you, Christopher, say later, or even before possibly, Alexander was the most like? And any final thoughts?
I don't know. Maybe it's just my pleasure reading this summer. I would say Napoleon, right? in the sense of, extraordinary military leadership over a short period of time that reshapes the map, but not in any particularly systematic way, right? Napoleon was a big deal, and then he was done, and obviously he left Europe changed, but he didn't leave a Napoleonic Europe, right?
Yeah.
And likewise, Alexander had an extraordinary career, but the end result was not anything that anybody wanted or predicted, right? It's a facile allusion. I've been reading the novels of Patrick O'Brian, so I have Napoleon on my mind.
And any final thoughts about Alexander, Christopher?
My essay trying to get into college was about Alexander the Great, because I had been captivated by the historical fiction of Mary Renault, who wrote a trilogy of books about Alexander, the last of which is out of print, Funeral Games, James, but it's about the period of the successors. And that was the first one I read, if you can believe it, when I was in high school, and it captured my mind. So I've got this super swanky, awesome job now, and I guess it's because of Alexander.
So Tom, let me ask you, do you agree with Christopher that Napoleon is a good modern analog or parallel? And what are your final thoughts on Alexander?
Well, my final thoughts are that there isn't any analog to Alexander. Not just for what he did, and there's a lot more to discuss. The issue of violence and cruelty, sociopathy, as some have said. I don't agree with that, but Alexander's accomplishments, good, bad, I think were in a certain sense, in terms of human possibility, unparalleled. And also, I go back to a point I tried to make in the beginning, Alexander's charisma for future times and places. The amount of fiction that Alexander has inspired from, basically his own lifetime until, as you said, Mary Renault and Stephen Pressfield and in every other language too, has been really amazing, and especially its cross-cultural manifestations. And since fiction tells truths about the human condition, Alexander, I think, has had an unprecedented effect in that way, which is one of the ways, and this is the last thing I'll say, that I so enjoyed reading the author that, James produced this incredibly valuable work on, Arrian, who's writing about Alexander, half a millennium after Alexander, and who's writing about him the way Plutarch did in a very different way, from the perspective of somebody who cares about, reflections on the human condition, philosophy, if you want to call it, and who says, well, Alexander won all of these great victories, but let's just all remember that no victory matters for a human being except self-control is one of the translations. Victory over oneself is another translation. In Greek, I think it would be thinking smart. It doesn't mean you have to be intelligent necessarily, but you got to think smart. And Alexander, he was good at thinking smart, for good or bad. And I think that inspired what is still an ongoing sort of wheel of fortune of fiction telling truths, inspired in manifold ways by Alexander.
Thank you. James, let me just end with you. Final thoughts on Alexander. And do you agree with Christopher that Napoleon's a good analog, or do you think, like Tom, he's sort of non-pareil?
Yeah, I'd agree that it's no analog that it really helps us understand him. It's a one-of-a-kind story about a one-of-a-kind person, and it's amazing. It's just an amazing story. I urge all your listeners to go further in exploring it, and reading Arrian is a great way to start, or Plutarch's Life of Alexander, also very good.
Well, I want to thank all three of you. James, I will link to your personal website as well as to all three of your academic websites. People can if they've enjoyed this conversation, can find out more about you and Alexander the Great by going there. So I want to thank all three of you for spending time speaking about Alexander the Great.
It was a great pleasure.
It's a pleasure.